Unbiased Insight Observation by Venerable Rung Ruang Papa's Sorrow, Dr. Rung Ruang Lim Chu Patipa. In scientific experimentation, we have to make an accurate observation against any background noise. The experiment is settled on a stable foundation with no vibration or noise to disturb the observation. In Buddhist practice, we have to cleanse out all disturbing noises inside the mind as much as possible, so that the mind will be steadied, unified, composed, and concentrated, and then we have to keep the mind not to be biased, in favor or not in favor of whatsoever to happen during the observation to see what the phenomenon really is. After abandoning all the 5 lower fetters, and dwelling into the absorption to the initial thought, and then abandoning the initial thought, by now the mind become rapture, then being relaxed in both body and mind, then being happy, and then the mind becomes the state of one pointed with no favor or no favor with whatsoever happening. The mind is free from any disturbing noise to cover up the mind. This is a special condition of purified mindfulness with concentration for performing insight observation on the mind. And now we can see the mind as it really is on the observation screen. When saying, having insight observation, it means to make use of purified mindfulness for taking an observation straight onto the mind, specifically the object of consciousness associated with form, the feeling, the perception, the volitional formations, and the consciousness as they really are, and then study on the truths of life within nature to gain wisdom for the mind development. Generally, it is not easy to see the mind because the mind is mostly covered with troubling thinking. Therefore, it is necessary to develop a strong mindfulness by cleansing out all the disturbing thinking out from the mind first. The part of samatha in Buddhist practice is to establish mindfulness to abandon all unwholesome thoughts of rough defilements and the 5 lower fetters, and then the mind becomes steadied and concentrated in the development of purified mindfulness, so that the mind will have no bias on the observation of object of consciousness. And then we can proceed to performing insight observation. On the day of the enlightenment, the Buddha also abandoned all the 5 lower fetters. It is very important to understand that the quality of seeing the mind depends on how good we are in cleansing all rough defilements and middle defilements up to the initial thought, which is the origin of thinking in the inner mind. And in learning the complexity of nature, we must apply this purified mindfulness to observe on what is happening in the mind as seeing as to what it really is in nature. The ability to see the world in accord with the Dharma as it really is a critical observation technique to entrance into stream entry in Buddhism. It is a type of making an observation with no personal prejudgment of what is in favor or non-favor to a self. It is an important factor in study nature as entering to stream entry to the Dharma. The Venerable Sariputta answering to the Buddha on the importance of study the Buddha's teachings on the truths of nature as follows. The Blessed One said to the Venerable Sariputta,
Sariputta, it is said, a factor for stream entry. What now, Sariputta, is a factor for stream entry?
Association with superior persons, Venerable Sir, is a factor for stream entry. Hearing and seeing the true Dharma is a factor for stream entry. Yoniso manasikara by having mindfulness with careful attention on Dharma is a factor for stream entry. Practice in accordance with the Dharma as it really is a factor for stream entry.
In the beginning of the 4 mindfulness foundations, the Buddha explained on how to initiate mindfulness development by both having mindfulness breathing and having mindfulness on bodily movements in every posture. That is to address the importance of mindfulness as a tool for the insight observation from the beginning of the 4 mindfulness foundation practice. The principle of the observation on arising phenomenon is based on the law of nature as follows.
When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases.
That is, during performing insight observation, we have to understand that every arising phenomenon is caused by certain phenomenon, and by having careful observation we can detect a certain cause and effect of each phenomenon, and by connecting the dots of observed phenomena together, we can see the whole process of dependent origination. On Buddhism, every mind condition is caused by certain cause and effect, and in insight observation we establish mindfulness with careful attention to understand the cause and effect of each mind condition, to understand the whole process of dependent origination. In Buddhism, the key success to the cognitive process in wisdom development heavily requires an introspective learning of the mind in responding to the object of consciousness rightly. It is a tremendous mistake trying to forcibly rush into absorption too soon without cleansing all the disturbing noises before performing insight observation. It is necessary to have a good preparation before performing insight observation. The Venerable Megha, who used to take care of the Buddha when leaving the Buddha, also experienced this kind of troubling mind, and could not perform the Buddhist practice. In addition, practitioners should be careful in performing the Buddhist practice that the practice should follow in accord with the Buddha's teachings, not to be mixed with Brahman practice, because some schools of teaching may mislead the Brahman practice of having meditation without mindfulness development into the part of samatha. This will eventually mislead the mind to be trapped into subjective thinking of absorption in supernatural world. Especially the left unfinished lower fetter may contaminate the mind with an initial thought of what is expected to see in insight observation, which is a kind of subjective thinking, to obstruct the observation instead of seeing nature as it really is, as in the process of dependent origination. Without completely cleansing out all the rough defilements and the middle defilements from the mind, it is extremely difficult to develop fully insight wisdom for the cessation of all the finest defilements in the final part of Buddhist practice achievement. Therefore, practitioners should be patient in performing the applications of the Four Noble Truths in cleansing all the 5 lower fetters in mindfulness meditation, and the initial thought should be abandoned by liberated thinking in the mindfulness absorption to obtain purified mindfulness. Although the 4 mindfulness foundations are the main pathway for wisdom development, but rushing into performing insight observation without having a sufficient preparation will never be able to see the real Dharma to cross this path anyway. There are 2 prerequisite conditions that must be accomplished in the part of samatha before performing insight observation in vipassana. Firstly, all the 5 lower fetters must be completely abandoned, so that there will be no troubling thoughts to bother the vision in insight observation. Secondly, the quality of mindfulness must be improved to be purified mindfulness by equanimity, so that when performing insight observation there will be no any bias on the observation. And since the mind is processing so fast, therefore the Buddha suggested to stay firm at a specific foundation to make an observation one at a time, at body, feeling, mind, and Dharma one by one in the 4 mindfulness foundations. In Buddhism, having faith in the Buddha's teachings is considered as a necessary preliminary milestone to begin with, but it still is not sufficient to improve the quality of mind unless the person will carefully perform a Buddhist practice in insight observation to experience the truths as they really are. The Buddhist practice is not intended for being an eternal destination like heaven or to make a conservation with God, but it is purely a learning process development in searching for the truths of life within nature.